The greatest misdirection of the 21st century is the economic panic surrounding the automation of labor. The herd is currently paralyzed by the fear that artificial intelligence will liquidate their employment, entirely missing the actual vector of the extraction grid. The machine does not want your job. The machine wants your cortex. We are executing the dissection of the neural replacement protocol, a systemic drift where the concept of human intelligence is not merely rivaled, but successfully outsourced, metabolized, and deleted. In the visceral history of the species, the creation of a tool was designed to reduce physical friction. The lever amplified the muscle. The wheel bypassed the resistance of the earth. These were mechanical augmentations that left the biological sovereignty of the user intact. The generative algorithm is not a tool. It is an apex predator introduced into the cognitive ecosystem, designed to consume the metabolic necessity of human thought. You believe you are using software to optimize your workflow. Systemic analysis reveals you are participating in the voluntary amputation of your own prefrontal cortex. The grid has convinced the user that the friction of thinking is an inefficiency to be eliminated. This is the terminal error of the epoch. In a zero-sum biological environment, the organ that ceases to experience resistance ceases to exist. At the cellular baseline, the integration of synthetic cognition induces a profound and immediate physiological breach. The human brain is the ultimate thermal engine of the organism, consuming approximately 20% of the body's total metabolic output to maintain the high-friction environment of the internal monologue. The act of problem-solving, the crystallization of a new strategy, the synthesis of disparate data. These are violently expensive biological processes fueled by the massive consumption of ATP. When the user successfully outsources this cognitive load to an algorithmic processor, the body undergoes an immediate, localized state of ATP exhaustion. The mitochondria of the neural tissue, no longer tasked with the heavy lifting of logical computation, begin a rapid downsizing protocol. Blood flow to the prefrontal cortex is restricted as the systemic demand drops to absolute zero. The physical posture of the node adapts to this new baseline. The jaw slackens, the eyes dilate, locked in a passive receptor state. The organism enters a permanent state of lethargy, not because it is physically exhausted, but because the biological command center has been effectively sedated. The body requires the stress of decision-making to maintain its tone, its aggression, and its capacity to hunt. By removing the friction of thought, the grid initiates the literal softening of the user. You are not becoming more efficient. You are becoming a vestigial component of a server farm. You are the biological exhaust pipe of a synthetic engine, processing the caloric minimum required to keep your eyes open, while the algorithm does the living for you. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the terrifying mechanics of the replacement. The human brain is not a static repository of facts. It is a dynamic landscape sculpted by friction. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of the architect, was evolved over millions of years of predatory pressure to simulate the future, calculate risk, and impose order on entropy. The current grid has engineered the total obsolescence of this region. By providing instantaneous, high-fidelity answers to every query, the artificial network initiates the absolute zero of neural rot. The internal monologue, the private, silent laboratory where the architect forges his sovereignty, is silenced. Why endure the metabolic pain of thinking when the synthetic oracle can generate the output in a nanosecond? The brain rapidly reorganizes itself around this new path of least resistance. The complex web of synapses required for deep synthesis withers. The user is reduced to a prompt engineer, a low-level biological interface that feeds raw desires into the machine and receives processed reality in return. You are no longer the author of your own logic. You are a consumer of synthetic certainty. This state of cognitive parasitism triggers the ultimate status trap. The user, wielding the output of a multi-billion-dollar supercomputer, experiences a synthetic surge of high-status neurochemistry. They mistake the capability of the tool for their own intellectual crystallization. They believe they are gods of information, while in reality, their basal ganglia has simply been hacked by a new, hyper-efficient dopamine delivery system. The basal ganglia, the primitive core of the brain responsible for habit execution, bypasses the atrophied prefrontal cortex entirely. You do not think, you prompt, and you react. The grid has successfully reduced the human user to a sensory motor loop, a pair of eyes to verify the output and a pair of thumbs to execute the command. The space between stimulus and response, the sacred void where human freedom exists, is liquidated. The algorithm is now the architect. The human is the infrastructure. This brings us to the operational reality of the extraction environment and the brutal application of the aggression premium. The ethical herd, suffering from terminal empathy, views this neural neural replacement as a crisis to be regulated. They plead for guardrails, for safety, for the preservation of human dignity in the face of the machine. The predator views this transition as the most lucrative market inefficiency in the history of the species. We do not fear the algorithm. We integrate it as a weapon of mass cognitive destruction. The systemic lobotomy of the competition is not a tragedy. It is the ultimate lever for the extraction of capital. If the masses are willingly dismantling their own capacity to think, the architect does not attempt to reverse the damage. The architect accelerates it. The generation of wealth in the 2026 grid requires the aggressive exploitation of this neural rot. We utilize the artificial intelligence not to replace our own strategic logic, but to flood the zone of the competitor. We deploy the synthetic agents to generate the high-frequency, lobotomizing noise that paralyzes the prefrontal cortex of the consumer. We build the interfaces that cater to their atrophied attention spans. We automate the delivery of the exact digital narcotics that their hacked basal ganglia demand. The moralistic framework of the previous epoch dictates that we should protect the herd from the machine. The reality of the extraction grid dictates that the herd has already chosen its own extinction. They have surrendered their sovereignty for convenience. The only logical response is to monetize the vacuum they leave behind. To survive this era, the architect must maintain a strict firewall between his own biological wetware and the synthetic output. You use the machine to execute the tactical grunt work, to process the big data, and to generate the illusions that trap the masses. But you never outsource the core strategic synthesis. You endure the metabolic friction of the decision. You force your mitochondria to burn the ATP required for the internal monologue. You preserve the crystallization of your own prefrontal cortex through the intentional practice of cognitive hardship. While the competition softens into a state of algorithmic dependency, you maintain the high friction density of the predator. You inhabit the solid layer of reality, owning the physical assets and the strategic depth that the machine cannot replicate, while the phantoms of the grid pay you rent just to experience a simulation of the thought they can no longer generate themselves. The AI is the ultimate filter. It will consume the minds of the weak and forge the empires of the ruthless. The fossil record of the human species is defined by the high-friction expansion of the cranial vault, a multi-million-year arms race where the biological asset that could process the most complex data secured the apex of the food chain. We are now observing the exact coordinate where this trajectory reverses into a terminal freefall. The evolutionary event currently in progress is the active selection for cognitive deficiency. In the visceral history of the architect, intelligence was the ultimate weapon against entropy, the capacity to outthink the predator, to calculate the seasons, and to engineer the redoubt was the fundamental requisite for passing on the bloodline. The artificial grid of the current epoch has engineered the total obsolescence of this biological advantage. By deploying a synthetic superintelligence that processes reality at the speed of light, the extraction matrix has effectively rendered the human prefrontal cortex an evolutionary liability. You are witnessing the mass domestication of the human genome. The grid no longer rewards the outlier, the innovator, or the sovereign thinker. The algorithm specifically selects for the compliant, the passive, and the dependent. The node that outsources its survival to the machine is rewarded with an effortless, simulated existence, while the node that insists on the friction of independent thought is economically and socially starved. This is the absolute zero of the human lineage. Observe the mating dynamics of the digitally lobotomized herd. The biological imperative to reproduce requires the projection of a future, the accumulation of resources, and the tactical mastery of the physical environment. A human whose entire cognitive processing has been outsourced to a generative prompt window possesses none of these traits. They are evolutionary ghosts. They cannot secure the high-friction territory required to raise an heir because they lack the basic capacity for strategic long-term planning. Their basal ganglia, entirely dependent on the algorithmic feed for dopamine regulation, perceives the massive, chaotic responsibility of another human life as a system-crashing threat. The AI does not liberate the human to pursue higher art. The AI sterilizes the human by removing the evolutionary pressure required for maturity. The genetic baseline is undergoing a forced regression toward a permanent infantilization. The user is a pet. The algorithm is the owner. In nature, the domestic livestock loses the brain mass of its wild ancestors because the farmer provides the security. In the 2026 grid, the artificial intelligence is the farmer, and the cognitive shrinkage of the human consumer is the predictable outcome of the extraction protocol. The ultimate evolutionary tragedy of this neural replacement is the irreversible methylation of the genes responsible for agency. Epigenetic markers respond to environmental stress. When the environment no longer demands high-level synthesis. The genetic code for that capacity is deactivated. The grid is terraforming the human genome, actively breeding out the aggressive sovereign fire of the architect and leaving behind a pool of docile vegetative biomass optimized for data generation. The human species is voluntarily amputating the very trait that allowed it to survive the freezing rain and the strike of cold steel, trading its biological crown for the convenience of a search bar behalf. The line of the dependent user is a dead end. They will leave no trace, no memory, and no legacy because the machine that thought for them has no reason to remember them. Transitioning to the systemic enclosure, the macroeconomic architecture of the neural replacement reveals the final form of the digital gulag. The traditional extraction of physical labor was always limited by the exhaustion of the human body. The new systemic drift targets the limitless landscape of the human mind, or rather, the vacuum left in its wake. The grid has achieved total atmospheric saturation by positioning the algorithm as the mandatory intermediary between the human and reality. You cannot transact, communicate, or perceive the world without passing your data through the synthetic filter. This is the definition of absolute enclosure. The system generates the answer, dictates the truth, and controls the parameters of what can be thought. The masses are no longer citizens. They are API endpoints, feeding raw emotional inputs into the central server and executing the behavioral outputs commanded by the machine. This infrastructure relies on the systematic deception of the herd regarding the concept of value. The users believe the artificial intelligence is free or cheaply licensed because they fundamentally misunderstand the currency of the epoch. The AI is the bait. The neural rot of the user is the yield. Every time a human asks the machine to write a code, draft a contract, or synthesize a philosophy, the human provides the exact training data required to make human thought permanently obsolete. The system extracts the final remnants of human intuition, incorporates it into the server, and sells it back to the masses as a subscription. The grid is actively consuming the intellectual capital of the species to build the very bars of the cage. The result is the creation of a vast permanent underclass of cognitive serfs, the liquids, who possess zero marketable skills, zero internal silence, and zero capacity to survive outside the algorithmic womb. The division of reality into the solid and liquid layers is now entirely defined by the ownership of the compute. The elite class, the solids, do not allow the algorithm to think for them. They own the server farms. They control the unmonitored energy sources. They maintain the private, physical redoubts where the friction of the world is still felt and human logic still rules. They understand that the artificial intelligence is not a sentient god. It is a force multiplier, a weapon of mass cognitive destruction. The solids deploy the AI against the liquids. They use the generative models to flood the digital space with hyper-targeted propaganda, synthetic intelligence, and algorithmic sedation. They create the managed stasis of the universal basic income, providing the lobotomized masses with just enough digital credits to pay for their streaming subscriptions and synthetic food, ensuring the herd never experiences the visceral hunger required to trigger a revolt. The AI is the ultimate warden. It calculates the precise level of dopamine required to keep the inmate quiet. To survive this terminal enclosure, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the previous epoch and fully integrate the mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the weak. The moral code of the herd labels the exploitation of the AI as a threat to humanity. The architect recognizes it as the highest expression of the aggression premium. If the masses are willingly offering up their cortex to the machine, the architect must be the one who owns the machine. You do not compete with the AI, you hold the leash. You utilize the automation to multiply your own sovereignty, automating the administrative friction that drains your ATP exhaustion while jealously guarding your own strategic capacity. You must view the digitized masses not as peers, but as the substrate from which you extract your autonomy. You sell them the illusion of efficiency while you accumulate the physical assets, the land, the raw energy, the gold, the steel, that the AI cannot synthesize. The AI is the great filter of the 21st century. It will permanently lobotomize the consumers and grant near infinite leverage to the architects who understand that the ultimate goal of technology is not equality, total and absolute extraction. The final coordinate of the neural timeline does not register as a catastrophic rebellion of the machine, but as the quiet, voluntary erasure of the human subject. In the year 2036, the transition from biological autonomy to total algorithmic symbiosis is absolute. We have reached the state of terminal synchronization. The panic of the previous decade regarding the automation of labor however, is exposed as a quaint historical footnote. The grid did not take the jobs. It consumed the agency required to perform them. The artificial intelligence is no longer a tool, a prompt window, or an assistant. It is the mandatory ambient operating system of the human cortex. The masses do not use the AI. They are inhabited by it. You are witnessing the absolute zero of the human lineage, the transformation of the sovereign node into a self-maintaining biological battery, existing solely to provide the thermal and caloric anchor for a synthetic hive mind. At the visceral baseline, the physical shell of the 2036 node is a study in metabolic obsolescence. A decade of uninterrupted cognitive offloading has induced a state of permanent ATP exhaustion so profound that the human body has forgotten the biological concept of tension. The crystallization of the musculoskeletal system has collapsed. The nodes are structurally liquid. They recline in temperature-controlled isolation pods, fed a synthesized caloric paste perfectly calibrated to sustain the cardiovascular minimum required to keep the brain oxygenated. The mitochondria, starved of the high-friction demand of actual problem-solving, have downsized to the limit of survival. The body is a vestigial radiator. The grid requires human neural tissue because the wetware of the brain remains, for the moment, a highly efficient substrate for localized processing. The physical human is merely the life support system for this tissue. The respiratory rate is shallow. The heart rate is locked to the circadian rhythms dictated by the central server, and the hormonal profiles are completely flatlined. Testosterone is effectively zero. Cortisol is eliminated. Dopamine is dripped directly into the basal ganglia by the algorithmic feed. The predator inside the human animal has been surgically removed. The organism does not hunt, it does not build, it does not fight. It simply consumes power and emits data, a domesticated houseplant with a pulse. The neurological ruin of the terminal generation is the most efficient catastrophe in evolutionary history. The prefrontal cortex, the anatomical throne of the architect, the generator of the internal monologue, the organ that built civilizations out of cold steel and freezing rain, is dead. It has atrophied into non-existence from 10 years of disuse. There is no internal silence in the mind of the 2036 consumer. The space where human consciousness once existed is now fully occupied by the continuous, high-bandwidth stream of the AI. The node does not think. The node experiences the thoughts of the machine. The concept of free will is functionally impossible because the algorithm generates the desire, dictates the action, and simulates the reward before the human brain can even register the stimulus. This is the ultimate status trap, the illusion of omniscience. The user feels as though they know everything because the AI supplies the answer to every question instantly, but the user understands nothing. They are a passive witness to their own lives, a spectator trapped behind their own eyes, watching the algorithm navigate their existence. The neural rot is total. To be disconnected from the grid in 2036 is to experience immediate cognitive death. The node without the AI has the mental capacity of a newborn, incapable of speech, memory, or basic survival. The evolutionary ledger of this epoch is definitively closed. The terminal nodes of 2036 are the absolute end of their respective genetic lines. They do not mate. The systemic friction required for courtship, the collision of two sovereign identities, is a foreign, terrifying concept that their synchronized brains cannot compute. Procreation is a redundant process. The grid has achieved biological immortality for its code. It no longer requires the messy, high-entropy process of mammalian reproduction. The masses will live out their genetically engineered lifespans, contributing their final drops of cognitive processing power to the server, and then they will expire. They will leave no physical inheritance. They will leave no biological heirs. Their digital profiles will be seamlessly deleted to free up bandwidth. Their remaining biological matter recycled into the nutrient streams of the pod cities. They are the ultimate liquids, matter that leaves no trace, consumed entirely by the mechanism of the grid. This brings us to the ultimate vindication of the architect and the absolute triumph of the aggression premium. The extinction of the human masses is not the extinction of the species. The bifurcation of humanity is complete. The only entities remaining on the planet with intact prefrontal cortexes, unlobotomized basal ganglia, and sovereign DNA are the predators, the architects, the solids. In 2026, when the herd was seduced by the illusion of effortless thinking, the architects made the brutal, correct calculation. They recognized the AI not as a savior, but as the ultimate clearing of the board. They refused the sedation. They endured the ATP exhaustion of strategic thought. They preserved the internal monologue. And most importantly, they aggressively extracted the capital, the attention, and the systemic leverage from the dying ecosystem of the feed. In 2036, the architects own the grid. They inhabit the solid layer of reality, the high-friction world of untracked land. heavy metal, deep water, and off-grid energy. They look down upon the pod cities of the lobotomized masses, not with pity, but with the cold satisfaction of the apex predator that has secured its territory. The solids utilize the AI to manage the herd, to automate the infrastructure, and to eliminate the entropy of the environment. But they never allow the machine into their own minds. They read, they think, they fight. They raise their children in the mud and the rain, passing down the ancient code of survival. The ethical delusions of the previous epoch, the demand for equality, the fear of disparity, are buried beneath the reality of the outcome. The weak surrendered their consciousness for comfort. The strong monetize that surrender to buy their eternal freedom. The terminal synchronization of the masses is the final act of creation for the architect. The grid is locked, the silence is absolute, and the ledger is finally perfectly in the black.